Right. Hello, everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. I think a few people have joined, maybe a few more will trickle in, but I don't want to wait too long before we move ahead with the webinar. So today's topic is going to be bandwidth best practices within Appspace. So what bandwidth consumption actually means, how we measure it, tools you can use to analyze how much bandwidth you're using when utilizing Appspace, as well as some strategies to help minimize that bandwidth consumption. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. A couple of things before I do that, though. I will say that at the end of this webinar, once the WebEx closes out, you'll be redirected to a survey. So if you wouldn't mind taking that survey, just a couple of quick questions, let us know how we did, give us any feedback, any other topics that you might see a future webinar on, anything along those lines, we're happy to hear from you. So if you wouldn't mind clicking through and taking that survey, that'd be great. We're also going to follow up after this webinar with some additional information. So you'll get a recording of the actual webinar itself, as well as some links to some of the things I'm going to reference as we walk through all this, just so you have it, so you can actually see kind of in detail that I'm going to talk about. So that being said, let's continue on. If you do have any questions along the way, there is a Q&A feature in the WebEx event. You can use that to throw some questions in there, and we can talk about those after we kind of go through the overview. Or if that doesn't work for whatever reason, you can use the chat feature. All right, so first, let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Will White. I'm a consulting systems engineer here at Appspace. Been with the company about 8 years. So I help a lot on the technical side, demos, POCs, all kinds of fun stuff. So if you do have any questions, again, we're going to send a lot of information afterwards, but you can always reach out to me with any follow-ups. And if it's something I can help you with, great. If not, I can get you in contact with our support team, with the customer success manager, and so on, so that we can address any concerns you might have around bandwidth, or of course, anything else when you're using the Appspace platform. So first of all, talk about what bandwidth usage and bandwidth management in Appspace actually means. We need to know kind of the base terminology, the base level of what we're talking about here. So as the screen in front of you says here, bandwidth usage in Appspace is measured of the total volume of content downloaded or streamed from the Appspace cloud. So what that means is any content that basically your devices are actually displaying that they've synced from the Appspace servers. Uploading content does not count against this. So you upload a video, upload an image, create a card, whatever, that's not going to count against your bandwidth usage. It is only that download from the cloud to those devices that counts as bandwidth consumed on your Appspace account. The second bullet there is one that I definitely want to take a moment to focus on. So it says bandwidth tracking is only for content delivered from the Appspace cloud. It doesn't include on-prem servers. That is true, right? If you have an Appspace on-prem server, that's all within your network. None of that traffic, none of that bandwidth goes through our cloud, so it doesn't count against that. But the other thing that's very similar that I do want to mention is that content that your devices fetch directly, right? So you've got a signage device in your network and it's going directly out to maybe a web page to display it. That does not count against your bandwidth either. That's what we kind of refer to as external content within the Appspace terminology. So if you're using our web view card to show a web page, as I mentioned earlier, maybe show an intranet site or a dashboard, that's not going to count. If you're using our external content feature to point directly to an image or video or something that's hosted on your network, again, that doesn't count because that's the device going straight to that content, not through our cloud. Similarly, if you use our YouTube card, for example, that's streaming that content, that video directly from YouTube, not us. So again, doesn't count for your bandwidth management. It is really only the content that you go into Appspace, you upload, right, and then it syncs down to those player devices. Even IPTV streams typically aren't going to consume your bandwidth management because those are coming from some other source. You've got an IPTV encoder on your network, or you're pulling that stream from the internet, right? And it's those player devices, your BrightSign, your Chromebox, your Samsung or LG TV, whatever it is, right, going directly to that stream and playing it, not to the Appspace server. There's a key distinction I like to make because that often does come up. Big picture, what this means, just to kind of give you a real world example. Say you've got a video you want to show on some signage, right? 10 megabyte video. You log into Appspace, you upload that to your content library. That's not going to count against your bandwidth, like total count, right? It's 10 megabytes up, but we don't track that. You then add that video to a channel that is published to 10 displays, whatever those displays might be. They're each going to download that video 10 by 10. simple multiplication, you've used up 100 megabytes of bandwidth. So at a very kind of simplified level, that's how it works. So as far as bandwidth consumption, there are a few different ways that we publish content in Appspace. It's going to have a big impact on how bandwidth is consumed. You'll see this kind of outlined here. The first one is a caching mode or a caching device. This is what you see kind of most traditionally. It's what digital signage is, it's how digital signage has kind of functioned for quite some time. So more traditional digital signage devices are going to follow a caching methodology. So things that would be things like a bright sign player, a Chromebox, a Windows PC, a Mac Mini, a Samsung or LG, all-in-one system on a chip display, right? Anything that's very traditional kind of signage based is going to follow that caching method. What that means, to go back to my earlier example, let's say you upload that video file, 10 of those devices, say 10 bright sign devices, all download that video file. They'll consume that bandwidth versus during download, but any subsequent playback, right, as they're just looping through your signage, showing that video, that's going to be playing back from their local cache, from their local storage. That means no additional bandwidth is consumed. It's essentially a one-time expenditure. This is great for video-heavy playlists, for video-heavy kind of interactive experiences, anything like that. Works really well because, again, you only consume the bandwidth once to download that file, and from then on, it's playing back from local storage. Much akin to grabbing a Blu-ray disc right off your shelf, throwing it in your Blu-ray player, a little bit of expenditure to get it in the Blu-ray player, but after that, you play that movie forever, and you're not actually using up any bandwidth. The other side of that coin, the other modes that you see listed here are streaming modes or streaming devices. There is some variation here, so we're going to dig into that. But this is any device that doesn't have that local cache or that local storage to store files. A lot of these devices are actually newer in terms of their support. And the reason a lot of them end up being streaming devices is because they're designed to be streaming devices. So we'll talk a little bit more about how this breaks down and which devices are which here in a moment. But these are devices that are typically like collaboration devices, something for video conferencing or screen sharing, right? Something like sharing your desktop screen or doing a video call. Those are streaming functions, right? You have to have a live stream of your face or a live stream of your screen. There's no way to really cache that, so they're designed with that in mind. So when we leverage those devices for signage or for informational messaging or anything like that, it's going to follow that same methodology to where it is streaming that content. And what that means, of course, is that every time a piece of content plays, it is going to stream from Appspace. Just like streaming a show on Netflix, right? As long as you're watching it, as long as it's up on the screen, it is consuming bandwidth as it plays back. So very important to know that distinction. There are a few different methods or different modes that streaming devices can function in, as you'll see there. So we did implement what we call a low bandwidth mode to help mitigate some of that bandwidth consumption. If you want to, you can run streaming devices not in low bandwidth mode if you want the full experience and you're willing to use up that extra bandwidth. And then we also stream content in interactive mode. So if you're familiar with Appspace, some of the different modes we can publish content in, our interactive mode is the kind of Netflix style experience, right, where you can navigate between different channels and kind of watch content on demand. That by default uses a streaming method because you could publish a ton of content to an interactive display. You might have a whole archive of videos, and so we don't necessarily want to download a huge archive of videos on the display, but there actually is a way to force that to cache as well that our customer success team or support team can help you out with if you do have that scenario. I did see a pop up there in the questions asking about a Chromebox. A Chromebox does cache by default. It does have that local storage, so it falls in that first category of devices. Before we really drill down into kind of the nitty-gritty, the specifics here, just overall best practices. First and foremost, identify your device content delivery modes. That's what we were just talking about. Super important to know whether you're caching or streaming, because that's going to impact how you publish content. Once you know that, define a content strategy. So what kind of content are you going to use? How are you going to publish it? And so on. We'll talk about that. That third bullet point is an optional thing you can do, but could be very useful, especially if you have a ton of streaming devices. And that's invest in a content proxy. That's going to allow you to really minimize the amount of bandwidth consumed. And then lastly, potentially schedule a content download. So if you do have caching devices, that's a way you can kind of pick and choose when that bandwidth is going to be consumed. So let's go ahead and jump in. So identify your device content delivery mode. This is kind of what we were talking about, whether a device is caching or streaming. Again, caching devices are the more traditional devices. You see that there at the bottom half of that chart at the right. So traditional signage devices or devices that are used for signage like Mac minis, iPads, Android tablets, Windows PCs, etc. They're designed with that in mind. They're designed to store a lot of local multimedia content and play it back from that local storage. Streaming devices typically fall in that collaboration category I mentioned. So again, things like Cisco Room Kits or other collaboration endpoints, Immersive Solstice Pods, Crestron Air Media, right? These are devices that are designed to stream because you're doing screen sharing, so they also stream signage content. A couple of things I'll point out about that is that there are some other streaming devices, if you want to think of them as such, and that would be any device that's running strictly via a browser and strictly running our web app. So if you pull up our app just in your web browser and register it and publish content to it, that's going to be streaming because it's not a dedicated app. It's literally just showing it as a web page, and all web pages, even if they cache for a short time before your browser cache gets cleared, they're ultimately streaming. So if you do anything like that, that's going to be a streaming device. And also if you use our publish to web feature. So when you're looking at a channel, you go to your publishing options, there's publish to web. If you enable that feature, you get the link or maybe the embed code and add that to your intranet, well, that's a website, right? It's going to be streaming. Anytime anybody loads that page that has that publish to web channel, it's going to load it anew. It's going to stream that content. So you're going to run into the same kind of bandwidth consumption as you would, say, on a Cisco Room Kit, right? Same idea, basically. One of the biggest components of thinking about bandwidth usage and how to manage it is defining a content strategy. This is the kind of thing that I think anyone who uses any streaming device, especially, should consider. Some of the others may be a little bit more optional, but this is something definitely worth thinking about. Two big bullet points to point out here. One is think about the content you want to publish and how you want to publish it or how you want it to play back. Digital signage, right, with a caching device, you could have a huge video playlist, right? It's going to download all that video. Again, might get a little spike of bandwidth usage when it does that, but from that point forward, you find no real issue playing a ton of videos there. But of course, on a streaming device, that can add up to a lot of bandwidth. Images and cards, right, more static content or lightweight content, that will consume bandwidth, but not nearly to the degree of video. So when you're dealing with a streaming device, first and foremost, just ask yourself, how much video do I need? How effective is it going to be in this environment? Do I really need to go down that path, or will images and cards, even cards with their kind of built-in animation, will that suffice? I will say a lot of times on collaboration devices that are more streaming oriented, you don't need as much video because they're not going to get as much playback time, right? Someone walks into a conference room or something, they're getting ready for their meeting, they're sharing their screen, whatever. They will see the content, they might get some important messaging, but they might not sit through an entire video while they're getting their laptop set up or whatever. So it's important to just think about it from a purely practical sense of what content makes sense where. Next, if you do determine, okay, we need video on this endpoint, right? This is key to our messaging, key to our communication. That's great. That is the case a lot of times. Think about how you want to actually publish that video. So easiest way to publish an Appspace, you create a playlist channel, you drop a bunch of images, cards, and videos in it, and you publish it and you're done, right? Super simple. But what that means is that whole playlist is going to play ad nauseum, right? It's just going to loop through all the videos and images and everything all day, every day. Again, great for traditional signage, but on a streaming device, maybe isn't ideal. So consider using some of our scheduling functionality, or especially our day parting functionality. It's built into those channels to limit when perhaps a video plays. So your images and cards, they might play 24/7, but maybe you, at the minimum, limit your videos to play only during business hours. So 9 to 5, 8 to 6, whatever, you use day parting. So the videos get added into the loop during that time, but at night, when very few people would see them anyway, cut the videos out so you're not consuming that extra bandwidth. I mean, at the bare minimum, right, you could do that like late night, right, midnight to 7 a.m. or something like that, right? You don't schedule those videos then, so at the very least, you're not consuming bandwidth when there's literally no one around. You could, of course, get even more granular if it's a video that's more targeted to people coming and going from the office space, right? Maybe you schedule it from 7 to 9 and from 5 to 6, right? Really get granular with when you show that video during the day so that you're consuming, at that point, a fraction of the bandwidth that you would be if it was just in a continuous loop. So definitely something to consider there. The other second big thing is to think about your content formats and resolutions. Again, this is important for all content, like images. You know, if you are building or creating your own images, uploading them to Appspace to display, you want to make sure that they're the appropriate resolution, right? Typically, most TVs are HD resolution. So an HD image would be appropriate, a 1920 by 1080 image. If you get much bigger than that in resolution, you're just kind of wasting bandwidth. You're not going to be able to tell the difference on a TV screen. So that's something to keep in mind. That is especially doubly or even more so true for videos. If you have an HD screen and a 4K video and you upload that 4K video, again, you're really just wasting bandwidth at that point. You're not going to be able to tell that the 4K video is playing back on the HD screen. It's not really going to look any different. So that's another big one to consider is make sure you keep in mind the actual display you're showing this content on. Another big one for video, which we don't go into a ton of detail here, though I'll show you another resource we have, is to consider the bit rate of the video. I think most people are familiar with resolution. Everybody knows kind of 4K and all that kind of stuff. But bit rate is one of those things that can really change your bandwidth consumption. Essentially, that relates to the quality of the video, right? A higher bit rate is a higher quality video versus a lower bit rate. If you go super low, that's where you're going to see like grainier video, that sort of thing. Obviously, you want high quality video, but there is kind of a sweet spot. If you go into a lot of video editing software and you make a video or you upload from a digital camera, right, and you're doing some editing or whatever, a lot of times that will give you a very high bit rate because they don't want to compress your video and make you lose quality. But on the flip side, that makes for really huge file sizes. So if you're making videos, if you're even downloading a video from the internet, right, that's something to take a look at is that bit rate. Even if it's someone else's video, you can oftentimes use a lot of free tools out there and commercial tools as well to re-encode the video, get a slightly lower bit rate, not really lose any visual quality up on the screen, because again, a TV is only going to show detail, but save a lot of bandwidth. At this point, I did want to jump over to one of our Knowledge Center articles, so I'll pop out the presentation there. We're going to send out these links after the webinar, so you'll have them. But just as an example of kind of typical bit rates, right? A 1080p video, typically in the 3 to 6 megabit per second bit rate range. If you go much higher than that, maybe on like a 4K screen, you'd see a difference, but you're not really going to see much difference in the real world. So you're really just, again, using extra bandwidth at that point. And to the point about 4K earlier, not using 4K unless you need to, right? If it's a beautiful 4K display in your lobby, maybe you do want to, but otherwise maybe not. You can see how much higher the bit rate is for a 4K video just on average and how much more bandwidth that's going to consume. So definitely something to keep in mind. Another thing that we wanted to point out is that you can use what we call a content proxy or a network caching node. This isn't just a kind of like automatic feature of Appspace. This is something that you can set up within your own network if you want to. We do have some enterprise clients that leverage this type of thing very successfully. So it is something perhaps worth considering. This is especially true if you kind of deployment, you're thinking about your endpoints, the kind of content you want to publish, and it just comes down to, well, we have to use a bunch of bandwidth, right? To get our message across in the way we want to get it across to be most effective, we're going to chew up a lot of bandwidth. And something like a content proxy could be very useful. Essentially what this is would be a proxy that sits on your network and handles content syncing from the Appspace cloud. So your different devices that are on your network, that are streaming devices, they'll still check in with the Appspace cloud to kind of report their status, say, hey, I'm online, you know, all that good like health monitoring type stuff. But when it comes to getting their content, instead of going to the cloud and pulling it down directly, they're going to go to that content proxy. So what that means is, say you upload a video, right? Go back to that original example. You upload that 10 megabyte video, you've got a content proxy set on your network. What's going to happen is that proxy will essentially download that 10 megabyte video. So that's one download, only 10 megabytes of bandwidth used. And then your 10 streaming devices are instead going to go to that proxy on your network. So yeah, they're going to use up some internal bandwidth to grab that video, but they're not pulling that from the Appspace cloud. That's not counting against your bandwidth usage on your subscription plan. So it's a way to hugely cut down on bandwidth consumption if you want to go that route. If that's of interest to you, we have some good documentation on how something like that would be set up. And what I would say is reach out to your customer success manager, reach out to our support team. They can get you that documentation, kind of walk you through the general setup, and we can help kind of get that infrastructure in place. Definitely something to consider for very large deployments with a ton of streaming devices, or even without that many streaming devices, but you have a lot of video use cases, worth looking into. One last thing we would point out, this is actually more for caching devices, but still kind of a nice feature. So those caching devices, again, by definition, use a lot less bandwidth, but they can create surges in bandwidth usage. So again, upload that video, 10 devices downloaded. That means that all 10 are using up bandwidth at the same time. You've got that kind of spike in bandwidth usage as soon as you make that update. If that's not great, right? If your IT team is yelling at you, your network team is yelling at you, they don't like seeing those spikes, they never do. Something you can do is schedule your syncing or schedule your downloads on those caching devices. So within each device's settings, you'll see a screenshot over there at the right. There is an AutoSync option that is enabled by default. That is the standard way that Appspace operates. So where when you log in, you add a new piece of content, all the screens that are supposed to play that content will then automatically download it and play it back. If bandwidth spikes like that are a concern, you can turn off that AutoSync, set it to disabled as you see in that screenshot, and actually set a sync schedule. So if you only want that content to sync late at night, you can do so. The flip side, you got to keep in mind, is that if you make an update during the day, in that case, you're not going to see that update take place until the nighttime. So definitely keep that in mind, but it can help normalize bandwidth usage, maybe offload it to non-peak times to where it won't impact like business critical functions. And it can be especially useful if you have remote sites that have much more limited bandwidth capacity. I've seen that used a lot for sites that they just don't have the bandwidth that maybe a corporate headquarters does, for example. That is an option that's available. We do try to make it very easy to monitor your bandwidth. So if you haven't already seen this, if you're an account owner and you log into Appspace, you should see a little bit of information on your dashboard, but we have a full bandwidth kind of monitoring tool in your account management portal. So definitely log in, take a look. It updates within minutes as bandwidth is consumed. So it should be a very real-time kind of view of your bandwidth consumption. So you can kind of see where you are, gauge where you are. If you're making changes or if you're already using a bunch, right? You can see that very easily. The thing I will say about this, obviously, we want to make this information available to you, but it's not, we're not in the gotcha business with bandwidth or anything like that. We want to be as helpful and consultative as possible. So if you see yourself using a ton of bandwidth, reach out to us, right? Reach out to your customer success manager, the customer success, reach out to the support team. We'll be glad to kind of figure out what's going on, what's taking that bandwidth, what can we do to kind of mitigate that usage, especially if you see you're using a lot of bandwidth and you're not sure why. Are you on a lot of streaming devices? You're not sure where that usage is coming from. We'll be glad to help you track that down because again, we want everybody to have experience. We want to use reasonable amounts of bandwidth. So don't be shy. We'll be glad to help you out as far as that kind of thing goes. I think last thing here, if you do have a use case that's just going to take up a lot of bandwidth, right? You've got thousands of Cisco WebEx room kits, right, that are streaming devices, and you want to put a lot of content on those. Great, you certainly can. It might require additional bandwidth depending on what you're publishing, and you can get that additional bandwidth from Appspace. If you think that's the case, right? If you look at your usage, look at bandwidth consumption, kind of think about all the things we've talked about, and you just you're going to need more. Definitely the more economical option is to buy it ahead of time. It is, you can see, a little bit cheaper to do so versus being billed after the fact. So something to keep in mind there as well. As I mentioned earlier, I think that's mostly it for the bandwidth consumption. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a quick survey after the call. I'll pull up the chat and the Q&A because we had any good questions here. So I do see one thing in the chat about social feeds like SceneSpire. So that actually works very similar to the external content I mentioned. That's coming directly from SceneSpire, so that doesn't count against your Appspace bandwidth usage. Even though it is a card in Appspace, right? That doesn't actually count. So what is the bandwidth that is used in low bandwidth mode? Apologies, I meant to dive into that more. Just got excited and moved on. So low bandwidth mode, that is typically enabled by default for streaming devices because we want to make sure you don't accidentally use more bandwidth than you mean to. In fact, if you look at those devices in Appspace, they'll have a little yellow kind of indicator next to them to let you know that they're in that low bandwidth mode. So you can certainly click into the device and disable that. Essentially what that does is disable video playback. So if you assign a channel that has images, cards, and videos, that device in low bandwidth mode will play the images and cards and skip past the videos. Just so that you don't accidentally use a ton of bandwidth you don't intend to right out of the gate. Again, if you know you want videos on those devices, you can disable low bandwidth mode, but it's kind of a fail-safe there to make sure you don't blow out your bandwidth allocation, super quick because you accidentally publish, a giant video playlist to a streaming device. So that's essentially what that is. Another question about cards, like the weather card. Do they count against on a streaming device? They count a little bit. So the actual data that it's fetching, no, that doesn't count, like pulling in the live weather data. But any kind of content on the caching device does use a little bit of bandwidth. So even like a small image, right? If it's a 5 KB image, right? It's still using 5 KB of bandwidth every time it plays. So there is some bandwidth consumption there. It's just not to the same degree of videos and that sort of thing. Then I'll see a question about content proxies, if they would work or if they would be helpful with caching devices. They certainly could be. In fact, I've seen them deployed in deployments that are pure traditional caching signage devices. Obviously, bandwidth on a whole is less of a concern there, but it can still be very nice because you'll be using less external bandwidth. So say you've got 1,000 caching devices, right? Maybe like 1,000 BrightSign players. That's still a big pull. If you publish a video, all 1,000 devices going out to our cloud to pull that video down, that's still a lot of bandwidth usage. Not as much as a streaming device, but it's still there. So that content proxy or that content cache can be useful there too, because then again, that would download that video, and then those 1,000 devices would download or get the video from it. That would be across your network, right? Not using external bandwidth, usually using internal network bandwidth, which is 99.9% of the time more plentiful, a little bit easier to manage. So it can still be pretty useful in that capacity. It can also be useful just, again, for remote sites if you've got a geographic region that just has less bandwidth available due to where it is or something like that, right? Maybe implementing a content proxy or content caching node for that region, for that location might make sense, even if you do have caching devices. I think that's all the questions I see. I hope I'm not missing anything there. We are at the bottom of the hour, though, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Again, any feedback, feel free to leave in that survey. Any follow-up, feel free to reach out to us, either to me or to your customer success team. Glad to help out with any questions you have on this or any other topic. Thanks, everybody.